You know, back when I was 19 years old, I was given the best piece of advice that I've ever received. I was told, Daryl, when you stop fighting, the fighting stops. Let's talk about that. Thank you for joining us on When I Stop Fighting, the podcast. My name is Daryl Dittmer. Today I'm joined by Ryan Weltz. Ryan is a recovering alcoholic who has found tremendous guidance and comfort in the writings of Stoic philosophers and some others. He believes that meaningful and lasting recovery is possible and improved with life lessons from the ancients, and that philosophic study is a wonderful strategy for improving the quality of one's life. Welcome, Ryan. So great to have you, man.
Hey, thanks, Daryl. I appreciate you having me onto your show.
You know, we had a chance to talk not too long ago on your show, which I thought was really cool, and I enjoyed our conversation, and you know, just really happy to have you on. I know we met via X, which I think to me is just the coolest thing on the planet, right? You meet people who you kind of resonate with, and it's really cool.
Yeah. You know, aside from the things that you post, I really remember kind of taking notice of your stuff, because I think you were posting about going to Alaska, you know, a vacation that you were planning. And it was very similar to one that I was going to do at about the same time. You know, I think you were going to like Kenai and Denali, and I was like, oh, it's cool. This guy's going and he's going to be doing a lot of the same things that we are. And then, you know, as I kind of paid attention to the stuff that you were talking about, a lot of the things that you're doing are things that I, you know, either enjoy doing or kind of aspire to do, you know, which is eventually retire, move to the mountains, and, you know, enjoy life with you know, my wife and dogs. So I tell my wife all the time, I'm like, man, I just kind of need to follow whatever it is that Daryl did.
No, I appreciate that. I wouldn't recommend everything, but you know, the whole the mountains thing is kind of cool.
Well, so far so good anyway. I mean,
yeah, no, that's cool, man. I'm you know, I know you have an affinity for hiking and being outdoors and just enjoying that. I'm assuming that plays into the, you know, the kind of the Stoic philosophy, right? Just experiencing.
A little bit. I mean, you know, when it comes to the nature stuff, you know, I tend to be a little bit more into, you know, some of the writings of the transcendentalists when it comes to that, of, you know, kind of that, you know, that mindfulness and contentment, and you know, just kind of allowing myself to appreciate things that you find in nature. You know, really paying attention, I guess, to the, you know, the sounds of the you know, the gravel and the leaves under your feet, and all of that. My wife and I have become, you know, kind of national parks geeks. You know, I'm rocking Arches today.
Nice.
I got my Acadia mug. So we really love the national parks. We're here in Kansas City, so there are no national parks anywhere near us. So we have to travel to get to them, but we always really enjoy it. We've got a couple of kids, and the National Park Service has a deal, I think they still have it, where if you have a fourth grader in your car, you get into the national park for free, your whole car.
Oh, wow.
So both of our kids have gone through fourth grade now, but we really made that last while we could, in terms of, you know, there was one summer, I think, you know, when my older, my son, when he was a fourth grader, I think we got 6 national parks worked out and didn't have to pay anything to get into any of them. And I don't know, the national parks are just something that I think that it's one thing that I think the government does really well, is, you know, preserving those places and educating about those places. And there's not one that I've been to that I was disappointed by. I've really liked all of them. But yeah, I think that does play into kind of where I'm at anymore, is just really trying to, you know, stop and smell the roses, I guess.
Yeah, which I think is, you know, one of the most crucial things we can do. And Arch is one of my absolute favorites. Love that place. I guess you could say my wife and I are kind of national park geeks too. We haven't necessarily chased too many of them down, but we've been to a lot. We have an RV, so sometimes we just tool around for 2, 3, 4 weeks at a time, and check out what we can. So anyway, I wanted to get into, and we're talking a little bit about sort of the aftermath, I suppose, in terms of living. But what brought you to where you are today? And if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit of your story, it'd be great.
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief. I've heard a lot of myself in a lot of the guests that you've had on. But I guess some of the notable things are that I really wasn't that big of a drinker in high school, not really at all. I was involved with, debate and forensics, and so they had weekend tournaments, and so we could do, about 20 weekends a year over the course of an academic year doing that. And so a lot of those involved travel, getting up early on a Saturday and getting out of town, and sometimes getting back late. So I probably missed more parties in high school than I attended. You'd hear about them afterwards, and a lot of the things that you would hear about are, who got in a fight, who hooked up, and who got the drunkest. And when I was, attending a party, if I, it seemed like, okay, well, probably not going to make my mark here by kicking anybody's ass, or really by hooking up either. So, I tended to like to let people know I was there, by drinking maybe a little more than I ought to have. In high school, that's probably none. Um, but that was, something I guess I did every now and again. But I didn't really get into any kind of trouble with it. But, you know, there really never was a time where I, drank and it was moderate or anything like that. It was, from the very first time, I started drinking, I really enjoyed the effect, and I wanted to basically drink as much as possible. Um, and so I always kind of, would drink as much as I could get away with, I guess. Um, but really, it didn't start to become a really routine thing until I went to college. I went to the University of Kansas, um, and for the first couple of years there, it was mostly just drinking on weekends most of the time. Um, we had we had this one party that got canceled. I was in a fraternity house, and we had a party that got canceled. And so I was living next door to this dormitory that was then full, full wall to wall with beer and cheap vodka. Um, and I started just drinking every night because it was right next door and it was free and I didn't need an ID or anything like that. And so it turned into kind of daily drinking. Um, then I decided to go to law school. I'd always wanted to go to law school. Went to law school, and law school was not the best environment for me. Um, so you get these big student loan checks once a semester. And so I'd pay out my tuition and my books, and then it would be like, okay, I've got however many $1,000 to get by up until, I can get the next check. And it seemed like I was always kind of drinking that amount of money down to where, you get to, it's 2 or 3 weeks before you're going to get your next student loan check. And all of a sudden you're like selling plasma, because you haven't budgeted well enough. And that was fine. I mean, whatever. I wasn't doing great in law school, but I wasn't failing out. I wasn't on any kind of academic probation or anything like that. I got through my first year. And then my second year, right before I was getting ready to start my second year, I got a call that my dad had cancer. And the prognosis wasn't great. And by then it was just like, my dad was sick. My mom, my mom had been an alcoholic my entire life, and her drinking was very toxic and life threatening at that point. And a lot of the people around me in law school seemed to have their stuff together. People were getting job offers for the summers, and like making connections. And if they went out, like some of them would drink, but a lot of them would get out and they would they would network and they would do the things that I guess you're supposed to go do. And I just kind of turned away from all of that and became pretty reclusive. And was the drinking got really bad. I mean, it was just like I had two liquor store this two liquor stores that I would go to, and I'd buy one of those big plastic jugs of Kentucky Deluxe, and it would last a couple of days. I wasn't really loving my living situation. I had like four roommates, and I was probably the worst roommate you could imagine because I was up, until 2 or 3 in the morning, stomping around drunk, drinking whiskey, and just, you know, I just think at that point, I just didn't really see a future that I wanted to inhabit all that much, and I didn't really know what to do about it other than to kind of mope around and be that way. And I don't know. Got through law school, moved down to Wichita, took a job down there. Before long, I was all alone down there, and I'd never lived alone in my life before, and so that didn't do any wonders for me. There was nobody to keep an eye on me or anything like that. I had a job, so that kept me in check a little bit. But along the way, I mean, there were times where the drinking got pretty bad. I mean, there was an arrest for DUI. There was, when I was graduating from law school, they have a ceremony at the University of Kansas where you walk down this big hill, you go through a bell tower, and you walk into the stadium. And but I was so sick at that point. I'd just gotten done with finals, and I was just drinking and drinking and drinking. I was so sick, I couldn't complete the graduation ceremony. I just left. So my parents were waiting down there. They didn't get any pictures of me graduating from law school. They're like, "What happened?" And I was just,
Oh, wow.
I was very, very sick. And so, there was an opportunity to move up to Kansas City from Wichita within my job. And so I just realized I was going to need to do that for a number of reasons. My mom had gone into rehab, and my dad was, he was living alone for the first time in a long time. And I just realized I was probably not going to be long for the world if I stayed down in Wichita doing what I was doing. And I saw an opportunity that I could go help my dad, and maybe that would give me a little bit of structure that I might need. So then my mom got out of rehab, and then she and I really started butting heads. I was living in with my parents for about 6 months, and I just didn't get along with my mom very well during that period of time, because I don't know, for me anyway, seeing her reminded me a lot of what I had become, and I was just so disgusted by that. And also I couldn't drink the way that I wanted to in that house. And so I moved out, and I met who was my wife. So she and I are coming up on being married for 15 years together. But half of that marriage was alcoholic drinking for me, and lying, and a lot of lying to her about how much I drank and how I felt, why I drank, and what my motivations for drinking were. And so there was a day about 8 years ago where she figured out exactly how much I was drinking, because she looked at a credit card slip, or logged into a bank account that I'd kind of used for all of the drinking and everything. And she was just like, she had no idea how much I had been drinking, when she was just like, I don't even know how it's possible for you to function with the thousands of dollars of stuff that I'm finding. And so there's bars on there, there's liquor stores on there. She's just like, when are you even doing this? Like, you have a job, you pick up, like, I'm responsible for the kids when she's working. She just couldn't conceive of the way that I squeezed all of that drinking into my life without her knowing about even a fraction of it. And the part of the drinking that she knew about, she hated. So when she found out how much there was, she was just like, this is insane.
Mm-hmm.
And through all of that shit, I had never wanted to not drink. Never once did I care, like, got arrested, went to jail, hospital, sick, wrecked relationships with people. I never did want to stop drinking until, there was this look on her face when she realized like how bad it had gotten. And I could just tell from the way that she was looking at me that it was like, it wasn't even anger. It was fear. And it was almost like somebody starting to mourn you before you were even gone. And I was just like, can't do this, and the desire to drink left me like that. And I haven't had, now that's been 8 years ago. And I've not really had a lot of strong desires to drink over that period of time. But it was also that I had kind of seized on that feeling and said, okay, you haven't felt this way. You better hold on to this feeling for dear life and figure out how to turn this into something that you're going to make work. So, by then my mom had been sober for like 5 years, and so I called her up and told her, what all was going on, and that was after I went to my first AA meeting, and that's how she had gotten sober. And so I called her, and I thought, well, this is going to be a real catharsis here. I mean, I'm burning my ships at this point, telling my mom that I'm an alcoholic. She's like, honey, I know you're an alcoholic. I've known that for a long time. And I was like, yeah, but now I'm saying it, like, so, that means something.
Yeah.
So she's like, so what's the plan? And I said, well, what do you mean? I mean, I went to AA. I told him I was an alcoholic. I told my story. I mean, I had a good cry. And she's like, well, when are you gonna go back? And I was like, what do you mean? And she's like, well, you're not healed. Like, how are you gonna stop drinking? And so I realized at that point, like, okay, this isn't just, all right, I'm going to retreat as far as to the ground that I can defend. I'm going to have to absolutely commit to this thing. I've escaped a lot of consequences, I think, along the way by, talking my way out of things and convincing people this way or that, things would be different, or that, hey, here's a set of ground rules I'm going to follow, and all of that stuff. And there was no more of that. There was really no more convincing anybody that this was going to work, and so I was like, okay, I really need to build some accountability into this thing. And so I called up a couple of my friends that, they didn't live in town, but when they tended to come into town, how it would be. And so I was like, hey, the next time you see me, dude, we can't really go out like that anymore. Like, I think I got to quit drinking. I'm an alcoholic, and I got to stop. And I mean, there was this part of my like drinking ego that was really hoping that these dudes would be like, you can't do that, dude. I mean, like, you're awesome. You're fine. You're epic. Like, we have an awesome time when you go out. And so I was thinking, or maybe even hoping, that they would try to tell me that, like, you're overreacting, and like, no, you're good. And like, all my friends were like, yeah, dude, that's probably a good idea. And so it wasn't my friends, that were causing me to be that way. I mean, it was, I was just in love with the drink. I mean, and I would do it alone. That's really the way I preferred to drink, really, is because then I didn't have to look at the way that people looked at me. So anyways, I got sober, and been sober, and it was meetings for a while, and then it wasn't meetings. So anyways, I mean, that's probably going on a little bit too long, but I mean, how it is. I mean, it was gross. I mean, there were things along the way I wish hadn't happened, and been trying to deal with some of the the blowback from that stuff. But overall, it's been wonderful, kind of reclaiming my life.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that, Ryan. It's so crucial to hear people's stories, and it's so crucial, I think. We talked a little bit before going on that it's cleansing to share our story, and just put ourselves in a position where maybe there's a vulnerability about it, but there's also a part where I know that by sharing my story, and you sharing your story, we're helping people, and we're doing good things for other people who may be struggling, or maybe just that one little thing that they hear that that helps. And sometimes that's all it takes. We all have those moments in life, those few things that really resonated with us. And I'm hoping that some of the things that I've shared over the years, have helped people in that way. So thank you for that.
No, yeah.
Um,
No, you're welcome. I mean, I don't mind, I mean, sharing any of that because I mean, I think part of the reason that this has worked for as long as it has is because when it's coming from somebody else who's been through it, they're not coming from a position of judgment, like, I mean, we've probably all been harped on by, quote unquote normies. And it's just like, dude, you don't know. But I mean, when you talk to somebody who's been through it, they can understand a little bit better that it's not like I didn't love my wife or that I didn't love my kids. It was just you know, I was laboring under a diseased set of thought processes and a physical and social and mental addiction, and it's tough to pull out of that. It's very engrossing when you fall into it. um Nobody would choose it. I don't think it, especially the way that it feels when you're trying to get out of it is really tough, because it's like, you know you get to the point where you can't go anymore, and obviously your life's pretty shambolic at that point, and so you have to start with the tools that you have at your disposal to start fixing it, coming out of whatever your rock bottom is. And those coping mechanisms are probably not very well developed, at that point, because we don't work through our problems. We don't, attack things strategically. We don't, deal with things, in any way other than to, numb ourselves to them or run away from them or deny that they exist. So learning how to be heads on, and deal with, the things that you've done and the problems that are going on in your life with an undeveloped set of skills is, it's a lot to ask of somebody to work through that alone. And so when they have somebody who has been through that to go, you know, it's okay, take things one problem at a time, one day at a time. You're not going to fix all this at once and in a day. um, that kind of guidance is really helpful for people who are just in that early state.
it is. I think it's incredibly helpful. One of the first things that didn't make any sense to me, because I was just a kid when I got sober, but one of the things that didn't make sense to me is when I started frequenting the 12-step tables and they said, well, alcohol and drugs is only a symptom of your problem. I'm like, really? What does that mean? How does that happen?
Yeah.
What do you mean? That all the drinking and the drugs are what my problem was, right? And then come to find out, that's not not entirely true. It's not even a little bit true.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's right. And I remember, looking at, the steps are on the wall, and you don't want to get ahead of yourself or anything like that. But everybody, you go to the meetings, and there are people who are in there talking about how, kind of struggling with my fourth step. I'm having a hard time getting through that. It's really difficult. It's taking a lot of time. It's really kind of screwing me up, and all of that. And I remember I was still, pretty full of myself, at that point. And I was just, I'd look at it and was like, the fourth, what's the problem? And and I would look at it, and I remember sitting down to do it and thinking like, I'm pretty much just a good dude who just drinks a little too much. And so now that I'm not drinking so much, I'm just going to be a good dude. And getting sober was a little bit of a lens wiping. You start to look at yourself in a little bit more of a critical way, and not like I was trying to beat myself down or anything like that, but when I did start to examine the mentality and the motivations that would allow me to lie to my wife, and to not be present at the times that I was around my kids, and to just not be my best, for really anybody. I realized that, the alcohol was really enabling a very, very toxic sense of entitlement and self-centeredness and selfishness. And that, for me to not be that way, or for me to even try to begin to atone for acting that way, I was really going to need to do my best to give back and allow other people to take priority more frequently. I mean, not make a doormat of myself, but learn a little bit what it's like to live in a universe where Ryan is not the center. And so, you know, I think AA worked really well for me when it came to that, because it was not long after I'd started that, I was chairing meetings, and we would take meetings to detox centers, and we would do that kind of stuff. And um, I I liked the service aspect of it. I felt like it was a pretty good antidote to allowing myself to think that I was the most important person in the room. Um, so I did like that, but it was I was 3 years or so into sobriety, and COVID hit, and it made meetings a little bit more difficult. My wife is a nurse, and she works in a hospital, and so there was concern, like, am I going to bring hospital germs to AA, or am I going to take AA germs and introduce them into the hospital? I mean, it was kind of not clear at that time, like, whether it's safe to be in groups. I mean, you know how it was, and so there were like Zoom meetings and stuff like that. I tried that, and to me, they didn't really have the heart and soul of the meeting. And so it was just, I was just kind of like going through my sobriety, more or less on my own at that point. And I found that that was okay. I missed the people, but I realized at that point that I had kind of gotten to the point where I had developed some survival skills, or whatever you want to call them, sobriety tools or whatever, that allowed me to not necessarily feel like I had to take problems to the group and have, get that feedback or anything like that. I just kind of, I was just freelancing my sobriety, I guess. Um, and I guess how that all works in with the blog and everything else is, um, I was a liberal arts guy in college, and so I was taking Western civilization, and so you have to read just an absolute ton of stuff uh, in that. And so we read letters from a Stoic, from Seneca, and I just had a very visceral hatred of it from the outset, because it described a person who was so unlike me that it was hard to read, in terms of like, hey, you can't let yourself get too affected by these things that, are out of your control. And you need to be at peace with who you are before you can't run away from your problems. You can't go somewhere else and escape what's bothering you. And don't worry about what other people think of you. Just work on your character. And, you should be okay to just sit alone and spend a little time in your own company. And if you're mentally well, that won't bother you at all. And I was like, God, this is not me, And so I really didn't like it very much at all. And so, but I remembered it, and
Yeah.
so one thing that I did do, when I was first getting sober, was to go purchase another copy of that book, and give it another look. And I thought that a lot of those concepts really ran pretty well with the things that we were doing in AA, and in terms of like, start a meeting with the Serenity Prayer, and hey, help me categorize the things that I should be working on. Is it stuff that I can't control, or is it the stuff that I can? That Stoicism's all about that. And so, I mean, AA is great for a lot. It's not great for a lot of introduction of non-AA approved literature. So it's not like I could really take that kind of thing into the room and be like, hey, like, if you like, as Bill sees it, you'd love, Marcus Aurelius. I mean, it's just not how it goes. So it was just it was about a year ago. My wife and I were talking about something that we could do, service wise, or service, oriented, that wouldn't necessarily be through AA. And so I thought, okay, maybe some of these things that have helped me along, like the stuff that I can relate to sobriety out of some of that, those philosophical writings, maybe I could talk about those concepts in terms of a little bit of my story, and how that all goes. And she thought that was a neat idea, and so it became kind of a joint venture. So I write when I feel inspired to, and she edits it, and then she does the art, and she kind of manages the website, and then that's kind of how it goes. The social media stuff attached to it was really at first kind of like what I thought would be, go encourage people who are talking about their sobriety, and maybe they'll take a look at your profile and then they'll find their way to the website. But then what really ended up happening was that you see a lot of the same people who are kind of being public with their recovery and stuff like that, and you develop relationships through social media with them, like you and I have, and you're just like, well, this is a much bigger universe of people who are out here, putting their voice into the conversation. And so that part of it's been really neat. I've done a couple of interviews that I've put on my YouTube channel, and anymore I don't know whose benefit that's for. I mean, sure, certainly I hope that the audience gets something out of it, but I also feel like I do too, because there are people who have had these really great experiences with, with their recovery and the things that they've done, and they inspire me a lot. People like you and some of the other people that I interact with. So that part of it's been really neat to experience.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really cool. I appreciate you saying that. I feel the same way, and I see your stuff and I read it, and I'll just let the audience know that Ryan is AKA philosophically sober, which I love that moniker. I think that's really cool because I think that describes very well what you do and what you put out there, and that Stoic philosophy. I think that's very, very cool. But it's philosophy, but it's also very much action oriented, way of life sort of stuff, which, I look at the 12 steps as something I was introduced to a way of life via the 12 steps. And then, I've just expanded it from there, which I think, you're saying the same thing. You've expanded it from that perspective. And so how do you look at recovery now? And I think you've explained it a little bit, but now versus maybe when you first started and you first ended up, and what is recovery now? What does that mean to you that maybe it didn't mean before?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, and you always ask good questions, so I should have been ready. Well, when you're starting out, there's so much triage that's going on, and so it's just like, okay, remember, going through early sobriety at work, and just feeling like, how long is it going to be before I find a mistake that I made months ago? And I got to deal with it. And so there was this lingering anxiety that maybe there were some problems at work that I didn't even know about. There are, if you really take charge of your life, there are different ways that you re-engage with the way that you function. And so there are amends, whether you're working a program or not. I mean, there are relationships that tend to need a little bit of sprucing up and some honesty there. And so I felt like a lot of early sobriety was a lot of damage control, and it was a lot of work and things that weren't necessarily pleasant. Some of the things that you don't think about when you first get sober are that there are repercussions that you may not really be expecting that come at times that you don't know that you're going to be dealing with something. So I didn't have a primary care physician for a long time, and I was just getting to the age I needed to do that. I got sober. I was 36. I just needed to start trying to take care of myself. So I went and had a physical for the very first time, and of course, that's terrifying experience, is like going and being honest with a doctor. How much do you drink? I mean, like, I'm sure my chart made it look like I was a pretty reasonable person whenever I was, answering that question. If I went in, because I was sick or something like that, but I was, probably a 2 drinks 3 times a week person on paper, but then you go and you meet, a doctor for the first time in sobriety and go, tell this doctor the God's honest truth about what's been going on with you. So I don't know. I mean, I guess my point is I had some blood tests done, and this was several months after I was done drinking. I hadn't drank for a while, but my liver enzymes had not, I guess, regulated yet. And so, they wanted me to go get a sonogram done of my liver and everything. And the only time that they could do it, I was there, and I was with my son, and he was still very young. And so, they put that hold. I don't know if you've ever had a sonogram, and the women out there are going to think that I'm just a baby, that I am. So they put this cold jelly on your belly, and they're rubbing this thing over, and they're like, all right, we're going to take a look at your gallbladder and your pancreas. And they're like, okay, we're going to go, take a look at your liver. And, that was terrifying, because you can lie your way out of a lot of shit. I mean, in terms of, I haven't really been drinking all that much, or, I was I would only drink a couple times a week or whatever. You can say whatever you're going to say. But when they're doing diagnostic imaging of your guts, the truth is right there, and so they're looking at it. And of course, I'm like trying to be the amateur, I don't know what they call those people, sonographers. I have no idea.
Oh.
But anyway, so I'm looking at these pictures, and I'm just like, what's that black thing? What's this or what's that? And you want answers, and you don't always get them. And so, I guess the point is that there are times where, like in sobriety and stuff, you'll be facing new circumstances, and you don't necessarily get the answers that you want at all, or you have to dwell in a state of lack of information for a while. So there have been a couple of times where I've had like medical tests that were outstanding, either for myself or people that I love, health situations or whatever. And so it's hard. Like just last year, late last year, I was at the doctor, and they did a biopsy on this area of my leg that, there was a question as to whether I had a, skin cancer. And so it was like 10 days that I didn't know, and, that's fertile ground for drinking, because you're just like, how do you cope with that? Or, when you have a serious health situation with a family member or with a loved one or something like that. And, it's not just something that hurts acutely that will go away. It's just kind of like your new normal, to deal with certain situations. Is like that part of being sober is challenging. I mean, it still is, but it's also like, I'm describing that as a challenge of sobriety, but it's really just life. That's not necessarily like, hey, this is the thing you're going to have to deal with as a sober person. This is what you're going to have to deal with as a human being.
Right.
And so, you just have to learn to, allow things to take place that you can't really do to influence them. Like it just, so the Stoicism bit of it does help. Having other things that you can do helps. I mean, my parents are both still with us, but they're getting on in age, and so it's not hard to imagine that, in 10 years maybe they won't be here anymore. And that's a difficult thing to conceive of. And if I think about it too much, it's just like, there's a whole reservoir of negative emotions that I can draw from at any point, if that's where I want to go. And if that's where I want to, occupy my thoughts, is to think about those negative things that I can't really, do anything about. It's there for me. And sometimes, I have to, just be very diligent to not allow myself to do that. And I think that I'm very glad to have, sobriety and the things that I learned in sobriety to kind of keep me from that. Especially because when I get to the point where I feel like I'm just kind of in a bad headspace and I can't really snap out of it. I do feel like if I could just go on, whether it's X or Blue Sky, and just find somebody who's posting about, hey, I've got 90 days sober. Sometimes I just spend 15 minutes looking for people who are announcing their sobriety, milestones, and I just congratulate the people who are talking about their early sobriety or their year anniversaries or 2-year anniversaries, because I hate for those to go unacknowledged. And it gets me out of my own shit a little bit. But it is kind of funny, just like sometimes there are these repercussions that come around from the way that things were that you're not necessarily expecting to have to deal with again. I just recently got admitted to another state to practice law, and getting approved without sitting for a bar exam is a very paperwork intensive process. And a lot of that is like background check and disclosing your sordid history with law enforcement and everything. And so this is 20 years after a DUI, and I've got to go call the prosecutor's office and get copies of my arrest records and stuff like that. And so you're just like, God, that sucks. But it was different this time. I haven't held those documents in my hands for a long time, but they didn't have the power over me now that that they had before. When you're talking about the way you used to be, and it's really the way you used to be and not the way you are, you can feel a little bit more self-assured of the progress that you've made through all of this stuff, to go, look, that's who I was. I mean, if you're taking shots at the way I was, you're gonna miss who I am now. I'm just not that guy. I'm capable of being that. I know that. I always got to keep, kind of centered on the things that are important and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not about. There's a lot less damage control at this point. It's not about, hey, I gotta go fix things with work, and I've got to go fix things with people. It's just, I feel like, and I know you've said this before, it's just now you're just kind of living life, trying to do it as a productive citizen, as a caring person. And I hope that I came through all of that stuff with a greater sense of, compassion for people, a little just more understanding of folks who are going through a tough time. Because you see a lot of them, in the recovery community, people are really going through a tough time, and that, if they could just get through it, if they could just kind of hold on and stay sober for a while, that things will get better for them. But it's a really difficult thing for people to get through.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, it can be, I don't want to say a grind, but life is a grind. And I think going into sobriety, I had no idea, man. I was 19 years old, barely 19, just not too long after my 19th birthday. So I was a wreck, and I didn't understand anything. And much of what I didn't understand, because I was young. So it was kind of like this palette of things called life that I had to ingest and figure out how to paint sort of a life that made sense and a life that was worthwhile. So one more question. We're going to get ready to wrap it up here, but
Sure.
And thank you for everything that you've shared. And this is a question I just thought of like yesterday, I think. But how do you feel about it when I say, this comes from one of my books, the road you're on is your own asphalt?
It's fair. I mean,
Right.
it's fair. I mean, the thing is, I would love for there to be like a unifying rule, that's just like, look, follow this and you're going to be just fine. But I don't think that that's how things are. And I've heard you say it before, is like, hey, just try to keep it between the ditches. We get sober, and when we do, a lot of us fill that energy and time with different things. And I think that you kind of have to, we've got, all of a sudden you got some free time, maybe, all the, time and energy and money that you were spending on booze or whatever, it's not in the picture anymore. You got to find something else to do. And so, like, it's possible. Like I'm kind of all or nothing about almost everything. And so if I decided to get really into, fitness, it could be that. And then I could just be like, just an absolute, disciplinarian of myself, to be like, I'm going to be in the greatest physical shape of all time. I realized that there aren't really any great, like, universal theories of everything that, like, this will work for everybody in everybody's situation. It's just like, you're gonna have to become a little bit comfortable with the idea of moderation. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the road you're on is your own asphalt. Yeah, I do remember talking to somebody one time, in the context of one of these therapy type visits or whatever, and she seemed to be very interested in, oh, well, you come from generations of alcoholism. There was normalized toxic drinking around you, so you had a predisposition to this. All right, I'll buy that, but I was a willing dance partner. I mean, like, there wasn't anything that there were opportunities for me to stop along the way that I didn't take, and so there is that. It's difficult. I mean, our decision making is pretty clouded, I think, when you're in the throes of it. Now, if I decide at this point, and I do think it would be a decision for me, if I were to decide to go back to using, that's all on me. I have every bit of support. I have every bit of knowledge. I have everything that I need to know what will happen if I go back. So if I found myself back in the throes of it, that would certainly be my own asphalt. I also recognize that in the process of getting sober, I had a lot of support structures that a lot of people, didn't have at that point, because, I was married, I had steady income still, I had kids to fight for, I had a car, I wasn't in prison. We don't all kind of start our sobriety journey exactly on square one together. I mean, some people just hit rock bottom, a lot harder than other people do. But yeah, I mean, I do think accountability has to be a big thing. I think, just taking the drink away from somebody doesn't necessarily set them up for success in life. And, there has to be a sense of gratitude of going through, coming out the other side of all of that, so yeah, I like what you have to say, a lot, and that I'm a fan of your books.
Thank you.
You probably would sell more books if you were pushing a message that was something other than, this is going to be work and it's going to be hard. You're not selling anybody on the idea of, quick fixes or life hacks or anything like that. I think what you're telling people is that, if you've got an able body and a sound mind, you have all of the advantages that you really need to start kind of putting your life back together. And you got to build the life you want. It's not going to be given to you, and you're not going to finish my book and a light's going to turn on for you and everything's going to go great. It's more helping people kind of reconcile themselves to the fact that the people around them who have the things that they want, probably work pretty hard for them, and particularly people who, can fall asleep and have peace of mind. That takes a lot more work than a lot of people are, than a lot of people really know. Um, Confronting problems is difficult, and it's a skill that you gotta develop if you want to have a life that's worth living. And so that's why I really like about your message is something like that of, put your work boots on, you know.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. And you were not paid to say that, so I do appreciate that
No,
immensely.
no,
I,
no. I
I
I
had a
did have
little.
somebody.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No. As far as the none of the stuff that I do is paid. I've never received anything. There's no um, I don't run any ads. I don't do anything like that. This isn't an income thing for me at all. I enjoy it as far as something that I get to meet cool people, and if I get to help people along the way, that's cool too. I've never really had any interest in trying to monetize any of this. And in fact, when we bought the URL, I was like, okay, like, you know, I'm in the hole for every, dollar and bit of time that I put on this. But I think, I try to look at all of any of this stuff is, if it helps people, it's worth doing. And I never put anything out there, unless it's something that I think is worth somebody's time. People have only so much time to devote to their recovery because they got all this other stuff that they've got to do. And so, if I don't want to write just because, hey, it's Wednesday and an entry needs to go up. So sometimes there's not one. And it's not because I'm lazy. It's just I don't really want to do it unless it's good. I don't. I just don't. I don't want to waste anybody's time.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just say this, and it's what popped into my head when you were talking. I was one of the best things that I've heard and just made me feel good about my books is somebody said it's refreshingly free of self-help jargon.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, that's just I can't imagine somebody saying anything nicer than that I want to hear because I don't want to be the mainstream, put on the happy face and all that kind of stuff. I want people to know what it takes, and hopefully I've accomplished that.
Yeah, I think
Ryan,
so. I think so. I mean, you know how I feel about it. I mean, I enjoyed the first one. I got the second one. I understand there's a third one. I'm going to be one of the first people that will be looking for that. I think you had let me know, that I could get an advance copy of the second book. So I was gratified to have one of the first cracks at that. And so, I mean, if people are listening to you, then they already know that you're not a BS guy who's just gonna sit here and just cat poster somebody to death. Like, you're good enough as you are. Maybe you're not. Maybe you've got a little bit of work to do. I mean, that's not to say that you're a bad person. I mean,
right.
it's just that, like, we're works in progress, and sometimes, we gravitate to things that are not good for us, and so it's good to course correct along the way. And it's good to hear somebody who has worked hard tell you that hard work is the way.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that, and thank you so much for your support with the books and stuff. So,
Sure.
so I think we ought to wrap it up. And I really appreciate you coming on. If you would just let everybody know where to find you, and I will also put this stuff in the show notes, so it'll definitely be there. But if you wouldn't mind doing that, Ryan, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. The website is philosophicallysober.com. There's a YouTube channel that you can find there with a couple of interviews, kind of like this one with you and with a couple of other guests. And I'm going to keep doing that. I'm on X and Blue Sky. I think the handle is at Philosoph Sober. The I wasn't able to get the whole thing squeezed in there, but I'm not hard to find when it comes to all that stuff. And so if you find something there that that helps you out, that's really great. I'm just really rooting for the recovery community. I mean, I love being a part of it. I love being involved with folks who are taking that, kind of outside of, just coming out of anonymity, and it takes a lot of courage. I mean, I didn't have that kind of courage. I'm 8 years in before I decided that I was gonna, like, come out here and have my name attached to it, to where I'm at. I mean, the people are really great. And so I just want to interact with that community and help where I can.
Yeah, and you are, and it's very cool. I mean, many of the things that you post make me feel good about sobriety and living and moving forward and doing the things that I do. So, it's interesting that we'll never know how many people we've actually potentially helped, and I think that's kind of a cool thing that I hang my hat on. Ryan, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Wonderful to have you on. Wonderful to see you again. And
Yeah, no, you too. I know we're both, a couple of months ago we were just living in this land of NFL expectation, and the idea that neither of our teams walked away with it is kind of wild.
yeah, well, we were hoping, but I got my Lions thing up behind me, and I'm gonna live and die on the Lions here for the next few years and see what happens. But
Well, I think you've got a lot to be excited about with them.
I think so too. All right, Ryan. Thanks so much, man. We'll talk to you later. Talk to you real
All right,
soon.
hey, thanks.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed When I Stop Fighting, the podcast, please check out my books and my journals on my website. You can enjoy a 15% discount by using the code PODCAST at checkout. Thank you again.